this game has such long cutscenes. Okay, we got that out of our system. Okay, no need to rehash it, re-stress it. We're done with that. Throwing it out the window. We're good. God, I don't even know where to start. Holy crap. I literally just finished watching the scene between Big Boss and David, and holy moly. Okay. Okay. We're going to start with a little, shall we say, speechifying. I hope you guys don't find this too boring, but we're going to talk about economy. You see, what most people don't understand, and I'm going to try and explain this in as much layman's terms as possible, so forgive me those of you who know what I'm talking about and know that I'm describing it kind of wrong to get across the point, and forgive me for those of you who don't care, but here's the basis of how economies have worked pretty much since economy kind of became a thing. We're talking all the way back in the BC era here. Economy refers to the flow of resources, the transference thereof. It's similar in concept to the internet. You might say the internet is all the servers and whatnot that house all the data that is then accessed, but that is actually not really true. The internet is the connection of all the pipes and Cat 5s, Cat 6s, etc. that actually connect all that thing. It's the same thing in this case. The economy is the flow of money, right? That's how an economy works. An economy in which resources do not transfer either isn't an economy at all, or quite literally doesn't work and will fall apart. We've seen this many times in real life as well. When it comes to economies, though, what tends to happen is they tend to base any given economy on one general feature of it. Anybody who's studied any kind of history knows what I'm talking about. Of course, the most common example that tends to be given is oil, because for much of the most recent century, oil has been the, shall we say, the major Tetris block of the world economy. But if you look back in history, you'll see there's plenty of other examples. Silk, anybody? Anyone remember when silk was a big resource and was something an entire economy was built around? How about amber? Anyone remember that one? And the Amber Road or the Amber Trail, whatever they actually called it. I don't remember off the top of my head. How about aluminum? Salt? There have been quite a few things, and it's not really the things you'd expect, because you might expect me to be saying gold. But I did a little research on this, and I've never actually found any large-scale economy which actually had gold as this particular thing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain what I mean by this. The idea is effectively that economies tend to build themselves on a linchpin, okay? And this linchpin sits as, like if you were to imagine a massive Tetris thing, a mattress Tetris of Tetris pieces, and each one of those pieces is a transport organization, or the actual people who work at it, or the goods being transported, or the people working on the goods in order to turn them into new economies, or the people who sell the goods at the actual consumer level. All of those little bits and pieces make up an economy, but in that, it's all basically sitting on this basin down here, which, actually it'd be better if I did it like this. You get the point. Big old basin down here. This basin is best described in my extremely vague terms. Forgive me, I'm not really good at teaching. As the linchpin, as the source, the base material of an economy. And again, an oil economy is the most modern, or at least one of the most well-known modern examples of this kind of thing. To explain what I mean by this, forgive me for getting a little bit more into detail here. The idea is that commodity, whatever it is so valuable that a great deal of those Tetris blocks rearrange themselves to suit them to it. In other words, oil or amber or silk or salt or aluminum or, there was another example I wanted to use, I'm trying to think of it. Silver was that way for a while too, in certain areas. Hell, copper was, if we go back far enough. These resources were so valuable that an entire, what you would generally refer to as an industry, develops around that. But the point is, it is so valuable that all industries are actually affected by it to some extent or another. Try and follow me with that, okay? So let's say we're using oil, because that's a more modern example. So you have to have, there's the oil itself, which has to be pulled out of the wells or whatever in order to use it, right? This is our first step, and yet already there are so many aspects of the economy that are affected by this one step, because we have transportation for people to and from there. which also relies on fuel, mechanics, the actual vehicles and whatnot being constructed themselves, which rely on the metal pieces being produced, which rely on shipping, which rely on and all of the at every step of the there's people working too. So there's people making their livelihood at every step of the way of this. So I'm just going to blanket statement that one, right? And then there's the people gathering the rubber. There's the people who actually assemble the vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. So that's transportation, which spawns off an entire industry by itself just to get to the oil to get it. Then we have the actual devices designed specifically to retrieve the oil, which again branches off into this gigantic. I mean, if you actually sit down and trace it out, and I've seen some people do it, and I myself have done it back in college. It becomes incredibly huge. The chart of how many jobs and how many economic steps, is what we used to call it, are created by something so incredibly simple. And so we've got the transportation to the housing, the water and food, both of which I can't even actually describe that generally because food is actually more like 5 different industries in itself if you really think about it. Water itself is a little more simple, but nevertheless just as valuable and just as much of an industry. Then we have basics of such things as entertainment for those people that actually spend their time and money on in the area, which also grow up based solely on the fact that people are going to be in this area, which makes it so that certain people tend to build not only entertainment things but things of need. All this food, water, transportation stuff has been built in order to acclimate to the fact that so many people are working on producing this oil, and that is what I'm trying to lead to here. I could talk about economy literally all day and I wouldn't even scratch the surface because it's this labyrinthine, incredibly stupidly complicated system that I understand way too well. I just have no idea how to explain it. But it's true with a lot of things. I am so terrible at explaining things. But the point is, oil, or amber, or silk, or whatever, is such a ridiculously powerful resource of its particular era, or of its particular region, or whatever, that it generates so much demand that other economies, other markets, other industries shift to accommodate it. Okay? This is what this means by the base point. This is what this basin actually represents. The fact that these other economies will go out of their way to hire new people, to seek new markets, to have new transit hubs, to have new transit itself, and to have new goods and productions and services which are geared solely towards that. And the thing you have to understand is this, you might say, well, how is an entire economy based on that? No action of such impact can affect economy without sending ripples pretty much all throughout its entire structure. I mentioned an economy as the flow of money, right? I actually was going to sit down and do a trace route, but when of basically here is how economy flows to actually explain it to you, and I did a little testing. It's right here, but it's 22 steps long. 22 steps to go from an act of purchasing a loaf of bread was the example I was going to use, and I was going to trace how that purchase circled around the economy back to the person who did the purchasing. 22 steps, which is why I'm skipping that. And that's just off the top of my head too. That's with only basic levels of research and whatnot. Think about how much then the purchase of oil goes through the economy. Think about how much that spreads it out, because all these industries shift to this way, and then industries that rely on those industries have to shift in concordance in order to adapt to their changing market and their changing structure, which then causes the industries that rely on that one to shift as well. And again, an economy is a circle. So everything shifts when one sufficiently important resource becomes the basis, the basin of an economy. Okay, you with me so far? Now, if you've played this game, you know exactly why I'm mentioning this. But let me stress one hugely important thing that some people don't actually seem to realize. And I've mentioned this to a few of my friends, too, and they looked at me kind of like, oh my god, I never thought about that. While this system is labyrinthine, complex, and ridiculous when you really think about it, the problem is every single one of the other examples I've given, and all the examples that have been true through history with some exceptions, actually produce something. Here's the thing. You can call war a product, but it isn't. Not really. Not literally. I don't want to mean like I'm splitting hairs, but war is only a product in the concept of the idea. It is not a literal product, and an economy that is based on something that is not a literal product is literally doing nothing but expending and not bringing in on the large scale and the long-term perspective. War does not produce anything. Oil produces something. Amber produces something. Horses, for God's sakes, produce something. back when horses were a basis of the economy, European, etc. But war produces nothing. War does not actually put anything back into the economy it is draining from. I've talked before about the idea that simple things. It's ironic we're so close to Halloween. This is actually part of why I wanted to do the Metal Gear Solid series around this period of time. Is because I've talked about how quiet things horrify me. I don't get into gore. I don't get into jump scares. I don't get into things. The more over the top you go with it, the less you have me. And I'll actually be talking about that later in this video. But the quiet things, the idea of the Templars in the Assassin's Creed series was the big example I gave last time. I'm pretty sure I mentioned it back then, but I don't remember. The war economy is probably one of the most terrifying aspects of any fiction I've ever personally encountered. It is not perpetuated by an evil or a malicious or an external force or basically anything. It is literally the embodiment of a system which is by its nature formless, and it is a system which is inherently self-destructive to the point of extremism, I might add. An entire economy which has a war, just conflict, as its basin, there's no future there. There's no possibility of advancement. Wars, I've talked about this before. In fact, I'm sorry, the episode I just did for Voyager, Q and the Grey, I talked about this exact same concept. War can be a catalyst, war can be an impetus for change, and I discussed that fully there. But when war is the norm, when it is the average everyday aspect of life, there is no change. You want to talk about a society that is going to stagnate. Think about a society that is at war constantly. Think about people who don't even have the ability to properly react to the horrors that are going on around them. If you're cynical, you might say we as human beings are already at that point, but if you think that, you have no idea how much further down we could go. I'm sorry. Desensitization is just a cultural phenomenon. Imagine if... There's not even anything in real life. Imagine if the internet, as to use it as an equivalent, was war. Think about that, really, for a moment. Think about how often you use the internet. You're using it right now, actually, unless you've downloaded this locally, which is fine. But, you are using the internet. You used the internet to get this video. Replace the concept of internet with the concept of war, and you have an understanding of what this society is and was going to be. Because it was only going to get worse. Comments are made throughout the entire game about how this whole war economy thing is just the first step. It is the testing ground for the SOP system, which is going to be soon in every single person, regardless of military application. Forgive me for segueing for a moment. I had a fanfic idea once, and the entire concept was going to be merging the Metal Gear Solid and the Fallout series together. I decided against it for various reasons. But having replayed through 4, I just gotta say, it's no wonder why I was thinking that. Remember everything I told you guys in the Fallout New Vegas lore run, and everything I was discussing about the culture and the history of the pre-bombs dropping society, right? Now, just push forward, meddle with the dates a bit, push it forward a bit, and it's not really hard to see how Metal Gear Solid 4, if, the system had not been stopped, had not been deleted, could lead to that sort of thing. Could lead to a sort of society where completely invading, forces and troops is so average and normal that nobody even thinks about it. To the point where all resources are consumed to the point of absolution, where even the tiniest little bits left are valuable beyond all monetary units because there's no more of them. Because the economy has been producing nothing, just draining the world and its resources in order to accomplish nothing, literally burning it off into ash. I mean, you think Shinra was bad for just burning a non-renewable resource. This is insane. Think about this sort of society growing into one. And the reason I bring that up is because it begs the question, how exactly do you change a society like this? I know, Big Boss's big thing at the end is about not changing society. I know, I just watched that. But I think it's pretty clear that sometimes you have to step in and say, whoa there, especially under these circumstances. I'm going to go ahead and talk about one other thing really quick. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of segueing here as it comes. Three major things, in my opinion, are needed or useful or otherwise used in order to actually fundamentally change a society, or at least can, I should put it that way, can change a society for the better. Number one, violent, dramatic upheaval. Fallout had the bombs falling. Metal Gear Solid 4 had the system being deleted. There are other examples, but I don't want to get too far into examples. Second example, slow, gradual, deliberate change, which happens inch by inch over a very long period of time, usually in the course of centuries. This has happened many times in real life, so I don't really feel like I need to give good examples here. Third, an external force comes in to alter and change things. Now, given the Metal Gear Solid 4 setting, which basically covers the entire planet, there really is no external force unless aliens are actually real. I just feel like pointing out really quick as an amusement that if you pay attention, all three of these things are why Earth is a paradise in Star Trek, because they got hit by all three. There was the Third World War and the Eugenics War. There was a very slow, gradual build-up, which was then assisted by external resources, aka the Vulcans landing. And I found myself thinking this as we were going through Metal Gear Solid 4. It's like, God, this world is so screwed. It's going to take the Vulcans landing to try and help them restore themselves. But I'm not even sure that would help at this point. My God. I digress. The other interesting thing about the war economy, I'm sorry, I'm not quite done talking about it here, is I'm trying to think of how best to put this. Everything I just mentioned leads to an absolute state of depression. I mean, in economic terms. Obviously, it's depressing otherwise. But the point is that there is no denying the economy is physically incapable, literally incapable of sustaining itself, right? The war economy. And yet it has to keep going. Why? Because if war stopped, we would face a total economic collapse. It's one of those incredibly ironic Catch-22 style situations. The thought that I have to keep running because my running is the only thing keeping me from falling off of this ledge, but me running is what's destroying the ledge. But if I stop, I'll just fall off of the parts I've already destroyed. You understand the kind of mentality there. Roy himself actually says it pretty much bluntly more than a few times, but it doesn't take even more than a basic understanding of economy and in economics in order to figure out what would happen to this world if everything just stopped dead. And spoiler alert, Revengeance kind of showed us what happened to the economy of the New World. It was screwed. Which is why we need someone like Armstrong to show up and be like, yeah! I'm not going to say it again. The other interesting thing, though, about the SOP, if you'll forgive me for kind of continuing on this in a general sense, the SOP system is fascinating because it actually controls genes, memes, and scenes. All three of the major themes of the intended major themes of the previous three games. Because it can control your genetic level, we've already seen that. It can control the memes through control of the information network and data and all that fun stuff. And it can control the scenes because it has total control over what happens where with regards to war, etc. And yet the funny thing is, this whole war economy created an unusual situation. It wasn't there yet because the war economy was still new. But given enough years of functioning as it was, of the new norm, I find it interesting to think that the war economy would have actually leveled the playing field across the world in terms of race, country, creed, that kind of a thing. Those things would cease to be important because so many of the militaries would stop caring about those things and would be fighting for something they don't believe in or care about. And as more and more people would have to become absorbed into the war economy, and their jobs would become either subsequent. That's not right. The word. It would be enslaved to the war economy, subservient. There we go. Would become subservient to the war economy, or would just become a part of it. You know, you get the idea here. The thought that after a while, so many people would be controlled by this SOP system that there would be, well, as John himself put it, a total state of uniformity. And forgive me for bringing Star Trek again, but that kind of sounds a lot like the Borg, doesn't it? Wouldn't it be interesting to think if they got their start like this, huh? So, let's go ahead and move on to scratching my nose, as I always do. Let's talk about another thing here really quick. I've actually got it scribbled right at the top. The idea of what the primary theme is of this game. Now, it's debatable if there is a primary theme, because there's actually quite a few, and I'll be discussing them as we go through here. But in my opinion, the theme that was most powerful throughout this game is the strong and undeniable difference between a person, an individual, and a system. This is manifested everywhere. To explain what I mean, though, a system is not a thing. There is no such thing as a system any more than there is such a thing as cold or darkness. These things do not actually exist. They are simply an intangible that is used to describe something else that we use as a convenience of communication. A person is a person. A person is an individual with will, with personality, with lives and dreams and hopes and everything else that makes up an individual being. And the idea of what a person leaves behind after they do, atoning for their sins, that kind of thing, is a very strong theme in this. But my point here is that a system is something that you basically can't actually fight because it is not an opponent. All you could do in a system is pull some massive kind of oh my god in order to actually delete all of it simultaneously. Yes, that's what actually happened in the game. I gotta be blunt, when I was first playing this for the very first time, I didn't think we were getting anything close to a happy ending in this game. I figured we would, I knew it was Revolver all along. I'll talk about that more later. I knew it was Ocelot. But, or at least I thought I knew. But as I was going through, it's like, there's no way you can fix this, because the only way to fix this is to remove the entire system. Like that. And how the hell are they going to do that? It should have occurred to me earlier, in all honesty. In retrospect, there actually is a fair amount of foreshadowing of the fact that the method to remove the system is to get into the system, and then remove it from the inside. And after all, the one thing they had was actually a convenient backdoor into the system, thanks to Ocelot, thanks to that whole situation. So go figure, right? But the really insidious thing about a system is, well, I've talked about this before, extensively. It is easy to point to a person and place blame or credit. To say, you did this, or you did this. You are at fault, or you are the reason I have something I love. And yet the truth is, almost every time it is actually a large group of people, right? But that's because we, as individuals, identify greater with individuals. The insidious part of a system is there is no blame figure, and there is no individual who can be deleted, or removed, or killed, or beaten, or harassed, or blackmailed, or purchased, or anything else that can fix that system, because the system itself is perpetuated by the system. That's what a system is, something that perpetuates itself. Think about that for a moment. Alright, that's enough depressing stuff. Holy moly. Let me mention one other thing here really quick. I forgot to mention this earlier, and that is to my own detriment. I was actually just thinking about this not too awful long ago. I should have mentioned that this game series in general employs a pretty good New Game Plus system, although I don't actually know for sure except for in 3 and 4, so forgive me. But in 3 and 4 especially, it has a really good New Game Plus system. And I just wanted to praise that because, as I mentioned before, it is my opinion that virtually every game that exists ever, regardless of genre or concept, is a game that would be bettered by the option of having a New Game Plus system involved. And I strongly and you know, I've used other games to explain why I feel that way, because the most often games that have it are RPGs, but this is a great example of a non-RPG that had a New Game Plus system that was great, because you get to play with all those goodies and toys that you worked so hard to earn last time, and you get to actually enjoy using them throughout the whole thing, not only to feel overpowered, but to actually add some credence and worth, some, shall we say, payoff to all the effort and work you put into them, other than just being able to say, I did it. So that's a nice touch. I also want to really praise this game. Yes, the game, not even the story. This is so weird. I actually forgot how fun the gameplay is of Metal Gear Solid 4. It is genuinely an enjoyable game to play, and I'm going to fail at explaining why, so forgive me. But every single mission of gameplay, with the exception of the rail shooter sections, is incredibly dynamic in how you can approach it. There is no path to success. There's just, here's where you're wanting to get, literally or in terms of an objective. Here is you, figure it out. You want to go through destroying everything, killing everyone? Sure, go for it. It's going to be kind of tough, and you're going to lose a lot of psych for doing it, but you can do it. You want to go through sneaking through, never even encountering one enemy? It's going to be also pretty tough, but you can do that too. If you want to start using distractions, or if you want to start using your gadgets in order to figure out this or that, or if you want to try and do a combination of all the above, or if you want to try and take a completely different route that accommodates for where the units are acting and behaving, you have options. You have tons and tons of options, and I found myself absolutely loving, especially the first few levels, and the levels in I think it was South America, where you were where there was the two sides fighting nearby, and you were basically kind of a part of them. Oh, that's another thing you can do. You can try and become friendly with the mercenaries or the PMCs or whatever in order to gain their help and assistance, especially in the fact that you don't have to hide yourself from them because they won't shoot you on sight, etc. Really good gameplay. It also had probably the best camera control of any of the Metal Gear Solids I've played thus far, and I really like the idea of using the Octo Camo kind of in place of the Wilderness feature in 3. I still think 3 is superior gameplay-wise, and for the reasons I already mentioned. But that being said, the Octo Camo allows a different type of variety in the battlefield, of not just blending in, but the things you can do with your mask, and the different ways you can present yourselves to people and hide from people, etc. is pretty much the same concept in a different application as using the actual camouflage suits and hiding in the tall grass and whatnot that you got in 3. So that was really good. While I'm here, let's go ahead and talk about the boss fights. Honestly, even though I love the boss fights in 3, and I really do, these boss fights were a lot of fun. The 4 Beauty and Beasts pretty much being top-notch. Of course, the awesome fight of awesome, and then the awesomer fight of awesome. I'll talk about those later. But in terms of sheer gameplay, regardless of all of their implications, amazing boss fights. Absolutely love them. My personal favorite in this game, not counting the awesome and the awesome, so in other words, just of the 4 Beauty and the Beast, would actually be Laughing Octopus. That was a ton of fun fight. I actually have a pretty good visual recognition routine, whatever you want to call that, so I almost always saw her, but it was great playing hide-and-seek with her in that little house. It was awesome. Let's talk about how a good example of gameplay and story integration. That would be the economy. The war economy. But no, seriously, think about what I'm talking about for a moment. Think about the fact that the player is going to be at a huge disadvantage if they do not willingly participate in the economy, thanks to Drebin. If they do not recycle things or use the cuts, if they skip cutscenes, if they don't hit the memory button, whatever they actually call that, the reaction button, I don't know what to call that, and if they don't recycle weapons back into him, they find themselves at a huge low in resources, which means they can't get the weapons and ammunition, all that fun stuff that they want, which means they're at a disadvantage. It is possible, but for all intents and purposes, you basically have to participate in the war economy to play this game, which is ruddy brilliant. And admittedly, I never actually thought about that before until I was going through this game, and I'm doing this whole thing with Drebin, and I've got 1 billion points stored up because New Game Plus, and I was thinking about, well, I don't even have to do this now, and then I paused and I was like, wait a minute, and it just clicked with me. Oh my god, that is brilliant story and gameplay integration. Speaking of Drebin, Drebin is a perfect example of how to maintain control. Really, if you're smart about it. Don't think too much about me on this, but honestly, even ignoring the Matrix, which also toyed with this idea, the idea of having a totalitarian organization and then having a rebel group and controlling both is not that out of bounds. It's basically the best way to enforce a total system of control, because you have the total control, which controls 80, 90, whatever vast majority of the people, right? But there's always going to be rebellion, because that's nature. That is human nature, and as a result of the fact that we are humans, and therefore everything we write is derivative of human nature, that's also the nature of basically every alien society and culture we've ever written. So in other words, it's basically hard to avoid the idea that people are going to rebel. They want their individuality, they want their will. Isaac Asimov in the whole Foundation series dealt with this entire concept. People will rebel against even a benevolent empire because it is an empire. I've had some of my viewers actually have that exact same perspective. And again, that's just nature. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people would rather not be controlled by an organization that is trying to take care of them and help them because they would rather not be controlled. And that's not a hard concept to understand. So the Drebins are a beautiful example of how tightly the Patriots actually have the grip on everything, because they are actively allowing people to rebel against them by going outside and bypass and otherwise skirt the system, except they totally aren't. They're under control the whole time. Or if I can use a much more easy to understand example of all of this, Emperor Palpatine, the man who controlled the Republic and the Separatists and would win no matter what. Think about it. One of the other things I like about this game is, while there are a ton of cutscenes, and there are, at no point did I ever feel bored, and at no point did I ever get to the point where I was just like, skip. That never happened. I mean, even if I wasn't doing this Rumination, I still would have watched every single cutscene, because I actually enjoyed it. Yeah. But my other point, reason for bringing this up, is they had a new idea in this game, which doesn't get mentioned as often as I feel it should. It's basically interactive cutscenes. I'm not talking about when you're on the plane and you can control the little Mark II or anything like that. I'm talking about, they had a thing where, instead of having to go to codec for every single bit of information, about maybe 30% of them would just be told to you live as you're moving around. So you'd be moving around all of a sudden, and between that, giving you some expeditionary dump, and the fact that the scene around you is literally changing and morphing based on the AI, ironically, controlling the situation and having, the little interactive dynamic battles happening, means that a lot of those cutscenes you can actually walk around and do stuff in. It reminded me a lot in many ways of when I very first played Mass Effect, the first one, of how amazing it was when, we're in the middle of this cutscene, or at least what I assumed was a pre-rendered cutscene, to use the proper terminology, and then, oh, no, I have to make a decision as to what my Shepard is going to say next. And I was just like, oh, that's awesome. The gecko are gross. I'm just going to say that. I actually have a note here that literally says gecko, ew. But the gecko, there's more to talk about here. Of course there is. I'm going to save most of this discussion for when we talk about Raiden and Vamp, but suffice it to say, the gecko are a beautiful analogy for this entire series. They really are. I mean this sincerely. They are cybernetic organisms, or cyborgs, to put it more clearly. In other words, they are a blend of technology and biology, right? But the thing is, they are a perfect example of why cyborgs tend to be considered superior in real life and in fiction over purely cybernetic or purely biological, because if you do it properly and engineer it properly, you get the benefits of both. The idea of the incredible agility and strength of these machines, based on the way their legs function, is very easy to understand, because while you can replicate that with a purely mechanical thing, it would be both more difficult, more costly, and more prone to failure. While that is certainly their weak point in terms of combat prowess, it's not that difficult to understand why they would actually deliberately do so. And of course, as we all know, cybernetic technology, that is to say cyborg technology, has been something the Patriots have had for a fairly long period of time, in the realm of like at least a decade in Metal Gear Solid terms, and have no problem using for their own ends, which also kind of leads to the problems in Revengeance, but we'll talk about Revengeance later. One last thing I want to mention, and this is just kind of aimed at the overplayed idea of this game being an overlong movie. I was reminded in the first several cutscenes and interactive cutscenes and gameplay of God of War 2. Starting in epic style, great music, great tension, great action, great pace, really got you started on the right foot, and really got you amped for the rest of it. And then, of course, brought it down a bit for some stealth sneaking sections, if you choose, and then bring it back up. Good pacing, in other words, and a great way to start the game. So definite positive there. Another interesting thing is this game kind of touches on it, but not really, the difference between augmentation and natural. I'll be talking more about that much later. In fact, it's actually like my last point here, if memory serves. Oh, okay. Second to last point. My apologies. But Deus Ex, the series, is the game series, the RPG series, is another series that has basically touched on this same concept. And it's not hard to understand why, because a lot of fiction has touched on this concept, and I have no answers for you, only opinions, of course, but the general idea is always the same. Why wouldn't you bother to augment yourself to the nth degree? Because augmentation is automatically going to make you superior to natural form, right? At the same time, there is such a thing as wrong in extremes, or in other words, you take it too far and you start to make things worse, or indeed lose the essence of what you're going for initially. Or to put this in a much more direct manner, Zero made the Patriot AIs in order to augment his own will, and then lost control of the Patriot AIs because he went too far with it. You see where I'm going with this. Now, how much of that is deliberate or not, we don't know. But it's just another one of those things. Like, for example, you could accuse me of augmentation, and you would be absolutely right. I have several metal parts in my body due to surgery. I wear glasses. Without augmentation, I would literally be crippled, physically and, in terms of my everyday operation with my sight, because I have terrible vision. And yet, if we took it to the absolute extreme and said, why don't we just replace all of this with cybernetics and machines, the question looms, and indeed we in real life don't actually have an answer for this, only opinions. Is that going to be better? Is that going to be superior? Is that going to be something that is going to be a positive or a negative? A lot of fiction deals with this in terms of just fear, automatically portraying it as always a bad thing. Some portray it as a matter of choice as to whether or not an individual can choose to become better or worse. All I have to say is this. When it comes to replacing, and augmenting your body, I agree more with Armstrong than I do with the Winds of Death, or whatever they were called, Winds of Destruction. And if you understand what I mean, you get why I bring that up in this context. I also want to mention one other little thing. Seiken Densetsu 3, which is a little-known SNES RPG, which I highly recommend, had a quote, which I'm going to quote for you now. All it cost me was a piece of my soul, just one little piece. But look at how far I have fallen without that one piece. I mention this because I feel like augmentation, just like power, just like money, just like any other form of removal of consequence, whatever term or matter it presents itself in and manifests itself in, tends to show who we really are as people, tends to lay us bare. Well, people can change over time. These sort of things empower us, allow us to do whatever it is we really want to do. And I feel like a lot of people would not really like looking at the kind of world that could be created when, if only even a fraction of a percent of human beings, if we were all augmented and we all had the lack of consequence, I think even a fraction of the percentage of people who would be, let's be blunt, terrible with such augmentation, with such power, could do with the rest of us. That's all I'm going to say on that. It's also worth noting, let's go ahead and move on here, that in the term of extremes, the concept of child soldiers is horrifying. And yet Eva herself really gives the best possible perspective on that, I think. Using child soldiers is bad. I think we can basically all agree with that. If you actually don't understand why, allow me to explain very simply. The human mind is designed to be incredibly dynamic and adaptive, and to adjust itself based on input. External input, which is then internalized to be processed over long periods of time. It's one of the reasons why problems at home or bad living environment or damaged parents or whatnot are such a thing that is so vilified, at least among some circles. It's because the damage that will do to a young child as they're growing up is so... let's just say that we don't even fully know the kind of damage that will do. We know the kind of damage it can do. Now imagine you take that same 5-year-old or 10-year-old who still has a adapting mind, who is still trying to learn and grow and form all those opinions that are going to make that person as a human being, and toss them into a battlefield, debatably one of the worst places that it is possible to be. Now let's say you take away their ability to feel pain, or fear, or anger. And tell me again why child soldiers isn't a bad thing. But Eva's perspective on it really throws it into contrast, because Eva doesn't, I don't even think she realized it, but she highlights through her example the fact that child soldiers like this are a byproduct, in many cases, not a intended cause. Because their families were killed by fighting, and they still have younger brothers or sisters or other people they care about, and they need to make money. Now, this is a very easy thing to understand. I've often used this in fantasy settings. I have tried to explain. I've done an essay on this. In fact, I did it for Lord of the Rings specifically. Go ahead, make fun. It's okay. The idea of why it is that joining a bandit group is so appealing, because this was true in real life too. Arguably, it still is. Why join a bandit group? Let's say you have two options. Now, I'm going to use extreme examples here, but I'll explain why in a moment. You have the option to go and try and learn a craft, or if you lack the ability or skills or inclination or patience or health in order to learn a craft, you can go and try to be a grunt worker. And in the process of so doing, you will eventually reach a point where you can sustain yourself, usually at a minimal level. If you are fortunate, you may reach a point where you actually have the ability to make something of yourself and actually have a comfortable life. If you're one of the incredibly rare few, you might maybe reach a point where you can actually have some degree of luxury in addition to comfort. Or you can go fight for them. Beat people up, which is, let's be honest, a very low requirement skill, at least as far as banditry is concerned. Yes, I know you could have skilled bandits, but my point is their barrier for entry is basically non-existent. Can you carry a club? Can you carry a sword? Can you carry a gun? Can you use said tool? Congratulations, you apply. And so doing, they might live a life of danger and violence, but they will be much better off financially and be much better, more capable of taking care of others if they have the inclination to do so. And that's why this whole PMC situation is so terrifying, because these kids who lost their parents, who want to take care of their younger brothers and sisters, are going to willingly join PMCs because that's where the money is. Because all that's required to join a PMC is basically to enlist. There is no barrier to entry due to the way they use their training situation and simulations, due to the fact that the nanomachines themselves coordinate and assist with you in combat. The actual requirement on you, the person, is practically non-existent. All you have to do is sign up. Is it no wonder that people want to join the PMCs? Is it no wonder that PMCs outnumber actual militaries? Is it no wonder that so many people are thinking about signing up when they get old enough? It's the same situation with the bandits. It's just 100 times worse because the specific situation, the specific scene has made it so, thanks to the SOP system and thanks to the technology of the times. And how do you fix that? Second. I'm not sure what I want to talk about next. This initial page is kind of generic thoughts, and then I started making notes in order as I was going through the game. Let's go ahead and talk about the Beauty and the Beast unit. My original thoughts were that the Beauty and the Beast were a form of magitech. In other words, supernatural mixed with technology. In hindsight, I take that back completely. The Beauty and the Beast unit is the personification of the pure technology, the cybernetic side of this game's representation. Everything they do and can and have is basically explained away by technology, with a few limited exceptions. They are also, all of them, byproducts of war in general, and probably some of the most ridiculously extreme examples I've seen in fiction outside of Warhammer 40k of just how bad war can really be on an individual and personal level. I mentioned earlier that I prefer a more psychological, quiet, use your brain kind of horror. I actually have to admit that probably the one biggest thing that I disliked about this game is the backstories of the four individuals in the Beauty and the Beast unit, because they're not just terrible, they're actually over the top. If you'll forgive me for being blunt, they are so horrible, so extreme in their severity, that I actually found myself having trouble wrapping my mind around just how horrifying and terrifying that situation would be. It is revoltingly bad. That was probably the intent, but admittedly, when I mentioned way back in my talk about the fact that I feel like Kojima is trying to either deliberately push boundaries or whatnot, the Beauty and the Beast unit was always what I was kind of thinking of with regards to, pushing the boundary of what is acceptable and what is not into holy crap levels. And then, of course, he one-upped himself in Metal Gear Solid 5, because of course he did. You have to keep escalating it, right? Whatever, I'm getting off topic. The personification of their technological advancement, though, is hard to underestimate. And the funny thing is, they are just step one, according to what Revengeance tells us. They are the prototypes of what you can do with a person, because they still have all their bodies underneath all that, don't they? And they can perform some incredible feats, but they had weak points and weaknesses. And a guy on foot managed to defeat all four of them. But the other thing I want to mention, though, about them. How do I mention this? I'll use this to segue into another thought. Do you think it would be better to kill them or to spare them? In other words, do you think it would be a mercy to end the lives of those four beauties, of the four women, the individuals involved, in order to terminate anything and everything that they have gone through and the horrors, the extreme horrors they have experienced? Or do you think it would be better to try and give them peace and a chance to redeem themselves, even knowing that in so doing you are risking the fact that you are just making things worse by letting them live? For reference, I used non-lethal methods on the four. It was the only bosses I killed with non-lethal, and I should say the only ones I went out of my way this playthrough, because I was in a huge hurry to try and get this video done in time. But I did use non-lethal on them because I could not bring myself to kill them, and that's my reason. And the very fact that it's being brought up is significant, but also significant thematically, because one of the other big themes of this game is, for lack of a better word to describe it, decay. Societal decay, moral decay, cultural decay, physical decay, economic decay. The idea of... It reminds me a lot of Dark Souls in its own way. The idea of a world and people that have grown so ancient and so old and so embittered that they're just basically barely struggling on. That they are going through the motions only because of one or two particular things that keep them doing so. Old Snake himself is probably the best example of this. And yet the interesting thing is the game itself toys with this theme a lot. This is probably a good time to go ahead and talk about Vamp and Raiden. Like I said, we'll segue here. There is a difference, speaking from personal experience, between being suicidal and willing to die, okay? Let's just make that clear right off the bat. Now, we're just going to push that conversation kind of out the window because it's not really relevant for what we're talking about, but I want to make it clear that when I say someone is willing to die, they are not suicidal, at least not necessarily. A lot of people in this game and throughout this game are willing to die. A lot of people in this game, well, a couple of people in this game actively want to die. Even then, I would not fully classify them as suicidal. It's more like they have reached the point where they have truly given up on their current existence, and they're just going to keep going until they are brought to an end. A similar example would be the four Cobras in Metal Gear Solid 3, if you think about it. Although that is all speculation, as I mentioned in my previous video. But Vamp and Raiden are the best ways to personify this difference of personality. Raiden is someone who feels like he's lost everything, who believes he is, unafraid of death, and indeed is unafraid of death, and has no other desire to go on but to accomplish something with the few days or hours or minutes or years or whatever he has left. And yet what Raiden discovers over the course of the game is he does have something to live through, and he does want to keep going. The difference here between Raiden and Vamp is Raiden, if given a choice, would choose to live. If all other circumstances were wiped away and it was just, do you want to live or die, Raiden would choose to live. Vamp would choose to die. And that is the difference between those two, as Vamp constantly wishes to die, wants to die, is ready to fade, for all intents and purposes, and is only going through the motions, again, for the purpose of trying to collide his way to the end and accomplish something while he's still there, etc., etc. But one of the things I find that is hilarious, not hilarious, but interesting, in the Vamp versus Raiden thing, it comes up several times, is the idea that Raiden is cybernetic, in other words, cyborg, and yet Vamp is too, but in a completely different way, because I'm going to fail at explaining this. Raiden was a skilled soldier who had parts of him replaced with cybernetic body parts to become a cyborg ninja, the third, or second, depending how you define it, cyborg ninja. Vamp had nanomachines that augmented his existing abilities. Yes, I know they explain away a lot of his powers in this, but they also mention more than twice, I believe it was exactly 3 times, but forgive me if I'm wrong, that all the nanomachines did was augment what he could already do. That makes Vamp a fascinating example of a bridge character. He is literally the in between, and debatably the very last example of supernatural in the setting. He is part supernatural, part superpowered, whatever you want to call that, and still augmented by the technology and helped in doing the feats he does and the way he does it by the technology of the times. And that actually makes a lot of sense when you really think about it, and is ultimately part of why I bring this up in the whole suicide, dark, etc., world is decaying, etc. Theme, because the reason Vamp wants to die is that exact same longevity. Is that I'm going to so fail at describing this. That sense of being done. He has given up. He has accomplished what he came here to do. Everything else is just going through the motions. He does want to help Liquid with his plan. He does want to, free the world from this control system, etc. He kind of already discussed that in Metal Gear Solid 2, so his ends are really no surprise. But his desire to cease is the same in, I feel, this is just my opinion, of the desire that the Four Cobras had to cease, in the sense that he realizes that this new world really is not for him. He is a relic of an older era that no longer exists for all intents and purposes, and he can now fade, and knowingly fade, as long as he accomplishes his last action. I don't know if I'm making any sense here. Forgive me. I'm trying really hard. I'm also going out with a very small amount of sleep here, so I'm just going to move on. Let's talk about more comparisons here. Do I have any more about Raiden? Looks like I do not. Let us talk about Naomi versus Paramedic. Now, this is me speculating, but based on what we know about Paramedic and based on what we know about Naomi, the two are again opposite sides of the same coin. Both of them are scientists, both of them are very interested in scientific theories, advancing their science, the pure science, as it were, right? The difference is Naomi, I always feel, especially in this game, but this was also present in Metal Gear Solid 1, has a conscience. She has a sense of morality and ethics that guide her, whether that is right or wrong, and indeed she accepts doing a lot of really bad things throughout the course of the games. Nevertheless, she does have a sense of right and wrong. She has a core to herself, to her personality. By contrast, the impression I always got from Paramedic, and I mentioned this back in 3, is that she didn't. She was amoral, whereas Naomi was willingly immoral. Whereas Paramedic would do something and not feel guilty about it because, well, whatever. Naomi would do something and feel guilty about that and want to apologize for it if given the choice because she has a sense of ethics and morality. And it's an interesting concept of the two characters because I feel personally, this could just be me reading into it too much, that the difference between the two can be best described as the fact that they have a core ideology. Separate the ethics, separate the conscience, separate the morality. Naomi believes in something. She believed in brother. She believed in the ideal of Big Boss. She believed in the freedom of the world from the Patriots. What did Paramedic believe in? What was central to herself when it came to ideology? Now, I could be wrong, but I don't think there was anything. I think she had no core. She had no core essence to her personality, and that's why she presented herself the way she is. Why to her it was just science, whereas to Naomi it was science with an end. And that's why Naomi had such a stronger sense of ethics, morality, etc., whereas Paramedic did not. It's also interesting to note that Naomi is indicative, is an interesting indication of the concept of loyalty. In the first game, she was loyal to Frank Yeager, and that was it. Everything else she had done was to that end, and she knew that she would be caught at some point or another, and she knew that she was basically throwing her life away, but it didn't matter because what she was loyal to was more relevant to her than everything else. This is something I discussed in Metal Gear Solid 3, and indeed we'll be discussing in a little bit here, as we get to the biggest example of that. But in 4, she is interesting because she's not on anyone's side. David himself, Solid Snake himself, actually says, whose side is she on anyways? Missing the point entirely, and demonstrating how he is still kind of rigid in his thinking. Because in real life, there actually aren't really sides like that. Not really. There's people on one side, people on the other, and people who disagree with other people. But the point is, an individual, not a system, will be loyal or caring or relevant to whatever it is they care about, and will therefore act in ways that are present and prevalent in order to benefit that thing that they care about, or those things, or those people. Naomi's loyalty showed throughout the course of this game as she assisted with the destroying of the Patriots and indeed the bringing back of Big Boss. And I'm sure, I have no doubt whatsoever that she had just as much loyalty to Big Boss as just about anyone else did, with the one huge exception, of course. Sonny, let's go ahead and rewind a bit here. I missed a point over here because I wanted to move forward. Let's talk about irony. Let's talk about irony. This is skipping ahead a bit, but I want to talk about this here. The original fox die was mutating in Solid, and would eventually cause a plague that would wipe out God knows how many people, right? Big plot point of the game. My first thought upon seeing that was, what's the point of adding that? No, seriously, why bother tacking that on? Because, in my opinion, it served no purpose as a storyteller, as a writer. And it wasn't until this playthrough that it really struck me what the point of that was from a storytelling perspective. The reason for having the first fox die turn into that horrible mutant death is so that the second fox die can then prevent it in order to allow David, not Solid, in order to live his life. Or to put this a little bit more linearly and bluntly, Eva, Ocelot, and Big Boss, and debatably Naomi, all die so that David can live, can actually live his life regardless of war, regardless of being a tool, regardless of being manipulated. And honestly, I kind of find myself thinking that's a fair trade. That all those people would, willingly or otherwise, give their lives so that he could move on, so he could enjoy those last few months or years, however long he has, just living. It's the chance he never actually got after Metal Gear Solid 1, isn't it? I'll talk about that more later. That's one of my final points. Let's talk about Campbell, Roy Campbell, because I should have done this different. Forgive me for my structure. Roy Campbell is another good example of loyalty, because loyalty can best be described as sacrifice, really, when it comes down to it. Roy was willing to sacrifice his family by alienating Meryl, and to constantly portray himself as someone that he found repulsive, and possibly alienate his friends as well, solely for the sake of protecting one woman and her child, and of course Raiden himself. Roy Campbell had enough of a conscience and loyalty to the mere idea of being a soldier in the sense of a person, or if I could use my comment I used back in Metal Gear Solid 1, Roy Campbell is enough of an officer, which is that perfect blend of a soldier and a person, in order to be willing to sacrifice himself for someone he basically didn't know. Because that was his loyalty to the situation. And it's a fascinating take on that, in that same concept. That pragmatism, for lack of a better way to put it. It also makes me wonder what he would have done if that wasn't necessary. But I'm getting off topic. Let's talk about Meryl while we're on the concept. Meryl is interesting because she was growing as a soldier right about at the time when the SOP system was coming into play. This gives her an interesting sort of circumstance in that she is actually experienced as a vet of some level or another, and yet at the same time so many of her skills are still adapted and benefited by the SOP system that she still uses it as a crutch. And yet when the system goes off, she is one of the ones who is least affected by it, at least later on when she learns what's going on, which is interesting in its own right. But I mentioned Meryl in specific because Meryl in this game, I feel, exists in the same manner she did in Metal Gear Solid 1. She exists to emphasize other characters. What she emphasizes in Solid is obvious. The idea of his self-hatred and the fact that he himself is willing to die, is ready to move on and leave it to a new generation. She also is a perfect example of the system in action. We see personally, and they go out of their way, the director goes out of his way or her way to show the things that she and her squad can do because of the system. Show the augments in action, actually show what it can do. And of course then they spend 2 hours talking about it with the point remaining. She also serves as a perfect way to explain Johnny, who I will now talk about for a bit. Johnny is what we call an ascended joke character. In other words, he was a joke character who was turned into a real character over time, or if you prefer, a caricature that then became a character. He is probably one of the best examples of the natural versus the artificial thing in this entire game. But the fascinating thing about Johnny is twofold. Number one, Johnny has no nanomachine augmentation. So you see him screwing up and you see him barely keeping up and all that fun stuff. But the thing that you really notice on the second playthrough is that he is keeping up. He is contributing to the team. He is helping the others. He is not on their level, and he is not coordinated with them like the others are. But this man, without augmentation, or rather, without nanomachine augmentation, without the extreme levels of augmentation they have, without the SOP system, is accomplishing these feats. Think about that for a moment. Think about what Johnny is actually pulling off, basically by himself. Think about what Johnny is pulling off without the superhuman aspect that the others get. It's no wonder that he is the one who ends up being basically the moral core of his team and demonstrates that throughout the course of the thing. It's no wonder that Meryl and he end up getting together, because despite her... Meryl has always been someone who is very strong-willed and very deliberate and very, for all intents and purposes, a strong female character. Johnny is someone who, by consequence, also had to be. Whether or not he ever was is debatable. But over the course of between Metal Gear Solid 1 to Metal Gear Solid 4, he grows to become that. Which also ties into that final theme, which again I'm not going to talk about yet. But the point is, he, through natural experience, got to the point where he was good enough to barely keep stride with the titans he was pacing alongside. And that is significant. It's also significant because it kind of ties all the way back into the Metal Gear Solid 1 thing. The idea of genes. Johnny is someone who obviously is not fitted for the battlefield. And yet he succeeds, consistently and repeatedly, despite that inferiority. There's a movie called Gattaca which explores this idea as well, and far better than I could in a few minutes, and indeed I will not discuss this topic in full, but the in brief concept here is, just because we have a limitation does not mean we are limited. We can accomplish great things in spite of our limitations. We can. The difference that so many people seem to make is they think we should or we will. And people get discouraged because of that, and people get frustrated, and people get depressed because you fail. Because that's nature, it's life, right? But we can accomplish great things, even ignoring our limitations, even ignoring our restrictions, and that is also pretty much human nature in a nutshell right there. And so Johnny is pretty much the example of that, I think, of overcoming his genes. Even more so than Solid himself, who, after all, was the inferior of the two or three, I guess, brothers. One final note about Johnny, which I think is really worth noting here. Johnny takes off his mask pretty much arguably the moment he becomes an awesome character. And that's the first time we ever see his face in the entire franchise, actually, including his ancestor back in 3. And from that point on, he doesn't wear the mask anymore, and we see him really showing his stuff, really showing his strengths, really managing to actually be given a chance by everyone else to be something other than a caricature. And yet, everything I've just said applies not only literally, but metaphorically as well. Up until that point in time, Johnny literally wore a mask. We literally didn't see his face. And yet up until that point in time, Johnny also wore a mask, just like all characters do, just like all real people do. I've talked about this concept many times. He wore this mask of the buffoon. He wore this mask of the butt monkey, someone who was someone you could just make fun of or laugh at, because it was easier to do that than to actually be honestly himself. Never once does he actually act in that manner after he takes his mask off, because he took his mask off. It's beautifully done, and I just felt like praising that. Okay, so we talked about Naomi, we talked about that, we talked about... Let's talk about Sunny. Sunny is another interesting concept, or rather, example of what exactly the war economy can do to someone, or indeed the very concept of a system can do to someone, because Sunny is a perfect example of a child with that adaptable, wonderful brain I've talked about, who has grown up basically without proper external stimuli. Now, what is defined as proper is debatable. And yet, real life has shown consistently that a human being who is young, who is in the single digit of years, who interacts with other human beings, tends to turn out better overall than one who doesn't. Sonny is a perfect example of the kind of person that can grow who basically does not get the kind of external stimulus necessary to promote cooperative growth. Because that is how human beings grow. That's why kids go to school together. I've often believed very strongly, and there's some studies that agree with me, and there's some that don't, that kids learn more in recess at school than they do in the actual classrooms because of all the things that they learn and adapt and grow with each other, which is then shared and then growed and then shared and then growed. It's the very concept of memes in a nutshell, to be perfectly blunt. That idea of cooperative growth, the idea of I affect you and therefore you're now affected, which then affects me and I affect you, etc. You see where I'm going with this. And when human beings' minds are so adaptive like that, that kind of system, intangible system that is created between people, promotes that kind of growth, promotes the development of their personality, their understanding of culture, identity, concepts such as rules and restrictions, and the ability to function, and the ability to be great creative in terms of thinking and operation, how to properly utilize their bodies to a greater extent, developing their strength, their agility, their stamina, etc. By contrast, Sunny is someone who basically had none of that. And it's no surprise that we see someone who has a stutter, who has difficulty talking, who develops herself into machines and computers because she believes that's where she can find that kind of external stimuli. Of all the things I dislike about Revengeance, which we'll talk about later, the thing I like most is what they did with Sonny. Well, the second thing I like most. The first thing I like most is Senator Armstrong. I'm not kidding. I actually think Senator Armstrong is an awesome character, and there's no hyperbole here. But that's a discussion for another time. I don't want to talk about him and his ideology here. Let's see here. I just feel like mentioning that the Guns of the Patriots scene at the termination of Act 3 is awesome. Don't really feel like there's much else to add to that, but it is very, very awesome. However, it is very thematically appropriate because it emphasizes in one simple way the very problem with a system that controls absolutely. It's the exact same problem that exists with a dictatorship. I've talked about this before when discussing governments on my show and on my stream especially. The problem with a dictatorship is it is just as good as it is bad because it is always dependent on who has the power. If there is a good dictator, that dictatorship will be good. If it is a bad dictator, that dictatorship will be bad. And the very problem with a system that controls something so absolutely as the SOP does is the moment someone else gains that control, they have absolute control because the system enforces absolute control. That's the thing most people don't understand about something like that, because there's really no allegory for that in real life. Thank God. There is no system that controls absolute. You could say money, but no, that's not actually how that works, and I think you know that. If someone had control of money over money to the extent that Ocelot had control over the SOP, holy crap, is all I have to say about that. Let's go ahead and move forward a bit here. I want to talk about this. Let's talk about this before we kind of do the rest of that. So let's talk about Snake a bit, Solid Snake. One of the things I love is throughout the entire game, and I noticed this more and more as I was going, he keeps constantly servicing and checking his weapons. That serves two awesome things. Number one, it's something a soldier can and does do in real life. Servicing a weapon, making sure it's clean, making sure it's well kept is like the second thing that you are taught when you go to boot camp. It is ridiculously important to maintain proper maintenance and stewardship and upkeep. That's insanely important. But the second reason I find it interesting is it's really reflective on where Solid is at personality-wise at this point in time. He's old, aging, dying, can't really smoke properly, the world has gone to hell, war is different, everything he ever believed in is basically a lie. What is left for him that is still comfortable, that is still familiar? I got the very strong impression as he kept constantly servicing and checking his weapons as he goes throughout his cutscenes in the game, that he was doing it specifically because it was something he knew. something that he could derive that degree of comfort from, and say, this is something that is mine, that I'm aware of, this is part of my world, and it's still the same thing, damn it. It hasn't changed. And it was probably all he really had left when you come down to it. At least as Solid, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. Forgive me, I actually meant to look this up prior to this, but I've been so rushed in time to get this recorded. In fact, I'm probably going to be interrupted because I'm going to run out of time here. I forgot to look up the name of the individual, but one of my viewers came out with a theory in my comments for a couple of my previous Metal Gear Solid games. It's basically the Solid Snake is cattle theory. Feel free to check the comments of Metal Gear Solid 3, I believe in particular. You'll see the theory there in total. I'm not going to give you all the points he gave, but basically several of the things throughout the game kind of hint at the idea that Solid Snake is basically cattle. Now, at first I was thinking, well, no, that's just silly. But I started thinking about it. Number one, this is the kind of thing that Kojima likes to do, both to troll his player base and because he likes to add layers of symbolism and whatnot. And the symbolism of that is best defined, I think, by the way the game terminates. Bear with me here, right? The idea is that Snake is cattle, right? Here's the interesting thing about that. A cattle is not a tool or a weapon or anything else. It is literally just a product to be consumed. It has the least possible amount of importance that anything could ever have that you still interact with. And that really, I think, emphasizes where Solid Snake is as a person, or excuse me, as a soldier, throughout the entire course of the series, all the way going back to Metal Gear, when he was just cattle to be used to go take out Big Boss, and Metal Gear Solid 1, where he was just cattle in order to go take out Liquid, or where he was Metal Gear Solid 2, where he was just cattle in order to set up the, you get where I'm going with this. He has been used and as nothing more than property his entire life. And here's where it gets funny. Right at the end of the game, John talks to David and explains to him everything, of course, and to us, but also tells him to live and to go out and to get to live his life finally and be free for the first time ever, to never be manipulated again. And that's the moment at which we can never play Solid Snake again. Think about it. We never see Solid Snake on camera after that point, and I would not be surprised if we never do. We don't know how much time he had. We don't know what life he did. He probably didn't even do anything particularly interesting or engaging. He just went to live his life, but that's the point, and it happened off camera because he was no longer being controlled, because he was no longer in the game. Make sense? It's also interesting to note that I'll mention two more things about Solid here while I'm here. First of all, he is really strongly emphasizing to Jack, to Raiden, that Jack/Raiden should live, should go on and try and strive for something else. I don't think it's because he knew about the Rose Campbell situation, although I have heard theories that he does, not because he knew, but because he knew Campbell. He knew the kind of person Campbell was, and he knew that Campbell wouldn't do that, so he knew something was up, which means he had a pretty strong theory about what was going on, and kept it to himself, because if he hadn't, it would have ruined the deception. And actually, I kind of agree with that in all hindsight. You tend to get to know your CO if you worked for him for a long time like that. But regardless of that, he keeps emphasizing this to Raiden because Raiden is everything, has everything in front of him that Solid no longer does. Raiden is the perfect example of what Solid cannot be anymore. And therefore, Solid, that is to say David, wants Jack to be able to live his life, just like John wanted David to be able to live his. I don't really have much else to add to that. I forgive me, because it's so, but one last point I want to mention here. I'll go ahead and talk about this, even though I'm kind of skipping ahead. Jack's ending is the reason I don't like Revengeance, because Jack was a child soldier who was manipulated horribly and used as cattle, and was someone who was little more than a tool, a weapon, oh my god, I can't even enumerate all the things he's been through. He has been through hell and back, and then went through Metal Gear Solid 2 and looked like he was going to be able to recover, and then he couldn't and didn't, and then Metal Gear Solid 4 happens, and then he gets even worse, and however, then Metal Gear Solid 4 ends, and it looks like Jack is finally going to get a chance to do exactly what David gets to do, to have a life, to actually be able to move on and live with his wife and his son. I also would be remiss if I did not point out that Jack fails to live his own life because he gets another game and therefore is being controlled again. Let's talk about Ocelot really quick. I don't know what else to say about Ocelot at this point that I haven't said throughout the previous 3 games. Ocelot, I have argued, I shouldn't say argued, I have postulated and discussed the idea that Ocelot is the true protagonist of the first story arc of Metal Gear Solid, which, as I've described, is 1, 2, 3, and 4, or rather 3, 1, 2, 4, but you get the point. That he is the central protagonist of this entire series, that all of the events in it basically hinge on and around him, and I still maintain that. I still maintain that even though he is still a bad person, I don't maintain that he is a good guy, but he is nevertheless the kind of person who is that perfect example of what Johnny is. Someone who, regardless of limitations or regardless of some situation, whether they be literally physical or otherwise, will do whatever is necessary in order to push himself through sheer force of will in order to succeed where others can't or don't. Ocelot, I've said it before, the boss's death had such a huge ripple effect on the entire setting, to the point where you could argue that everything in the entire setting started with that. I'll talk about that in a minute. And yet Ocelot is the one who is constantly affecting the setting, all the way from Metal Gear Solid 3 to 4. He is the one who is not just sending out ripples, he is actively retracing and putting down levees, or making levees out of the water and damming up the water, and just... This analogy is going out of control, but you get the point. He is the one who changes everything about this entire setting. And it's beautiful because I mentioned before I was not surprised that it was Ocelot. 2 big reasons. One, the voice acting. I know that's kind of a weird thing to pull off of, but the fact is, when they actually had him being controlled by Liquid back in Metal Gear Solid 2, they used Liquid's voice actor, Cam Clark, who is still available in order to do his voice acting in 4. They never used his voice actor in 4. And I felt like that was significant. As it turns out, that actually was significant because of voice acting issues that happened with the Japanese actors, and the script was actually kind of rewritten a bit to accommodate that. But... Sorry, phone call. Ocelot... I'm sorry, forgive me for this, but Ocelot is so fascinating as a character because he is the kind of character that he's basically a Palpatine type character. He does have his supernatural ability. He's damn good at CQC thanks to his training from John, and he is basically a really awesome shot. And yet, despite that, he is the person who changes the world around him, which consists of both the supernatural and the incredibly technologically advanced, and does so through sheer force of will and careful consideration and excellent application of skill, etc., etc. If I could use a comparison here, he is the equivalent of Jim Raynor in terms of, or actually, no, he's probably more like a comparison of Arcturus Mengsk over in StarCraft 2. Someone who, in a setting that consists of super advanced alien organisms and psionics and basically magic and all that fun stuff, he is the one who actually changes the world more than once. And I don't know why. I've always loved Ocelot as a character. Forgive me. I'm going to kind of chop this off short because I don't know what else to say about him. He's just such a fascinating character. Especially because there's one last thing to talk about him. Why does Ocelot do everything he does throughout, basically in the gap after the end of Metal Gear Solid 3 up until his death in Metal Gear Solid 4? If you were to ask my opinion on that, because we only have speculation until 5 comes out, and if you ask my opinion, I would say he does it, and did it because he loved the boss. That is to say, Big Boss. He loved John. Whether it was romantically or not is totally irrelevant. In fact, if I could be so blunt, I don't actually think it did have a romantic tint to it. I think it was similar to the relationship that John had with Boss, the Joy, whatever you want to call her. Such a strong connection, such a strong emotional, mental connection to someone, to the point where you will do anything for them. I've heard people say that, I'll do anything for you, or I'll do anything to be with you, or whatever. Most people don't know what those words mean. Ocelot did anything for Big Boss. He actually did it. Think about all that he does throughout the course of the games. Think about everything he accomplishes as all for the sole purpose of reaching Big Boss, freeing him, helping him with his dream and goals, etc., etc. He did it all for him, in my opinion. Think about that for a moment. Think about the kind of dedication and loyalty that requires. That is an example of Nakama, or at least it would be if Big Boss felt the same way back. And I don't know if he did or not. I'm going to hesitate on speculation here because I have a very strong feeling Metal Gear Solid 5 is going to shed light on this, but I've wondered on this for a long time. There is no doubt Ocelot loved Big Boss. Like I said, however you want to define it doesn't matter. There was definitely phileo there. There was definitely agapeo there. Whether there was eros or not is debatable. Who knows? But whether or not Big Boss, John, shared any of those feelings back, actually cared about Ocelot back, we have no idea. It makes me wonder. Let's rewind a bit here. I promised my sister I would zoom. Like I said, I'm going to be interrupted soon. Shadow Moses stage was awesome. Shadow Moses stage is an excellent example of good nostalgia. Genuinely good nostalgia. And in my opinion, the best way to describe that is good nostalgia is when you take something and have a genuine positivity, joy in whatever it is you are referencing and whatever it is you're being nostalgic about, and then just celebrate it. Don't pay lip service to it. Don't make a parody of it. Celebrate it. Now, sometimes celebrating it can involve being a parody of it. See, Saints Row 4 is a great example, parodying itself constantly, but it did so with such honest exuberance and enthusiasm that you were just, yeah, the whole time. The Metal Gear, the Shadow Moses stage in this one is pretty much the exact same thing for me. If you haven't played this game before, and you like the series, for God's sakes, you owe it to yourself at least to play through the game up to this point where you get to go through that awesome, awesome stage. Including the section where you actually get to play a bit of Metal Gear Solid 1 with the Metal Gear Solid 1 controls and the Metal Gear Solid 1 graphics and Yui. It's a dream that Snake was having, in case you're wondering. It's also kind of interesting to complex. Let's go ahead and talk about Naomi and Hal. Not the romantic aspect, but rather the way that they differ as scientists. Or, to put this differently, I find myself wondering if Hal would have been as grief-ridden and more capable, more willing to die, if he had been a more complex individual at his core than Naomi was. If he had had a different past like Naomi did. Hal, at his core, has always been a very simple person. I don't mean that as an insult. I mean this as the O'Brien effect. In other words, he's a simple guy. And that's it. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's actually something to be inspiring, if I could be blunt. I know very few people who are just simple people in real life. In fact, I can name 2 off the top of my head. And I kind of envy those people. I am not a simple person, right? But the thing is, complex people tend to branch out in unforeseen and wild deviations of variation in their lifestyles. And so again, Naomi was someone who wanted to do good with her science, ended up doing evil with her science, and paid for it with her life. Hal was someone who wanted to do science for good, ended up doing science for evil, and paid for it by continuing to live. And I think that's the best way to emphasize the difference between the two. Let's talk about the second best thing in ever. When I got to the section where it was Rex versus Ray, even though I've done it before, I was still just like, yeah! Because it's awesome. Again, it is that exact same aspect of enthusiasm and joy that really it should have. As soon as I got to Rex and saw that the very first time I played this, and saw that the railgun was lost, my first thought was, crap. And then he went over and started working with it, and he says, I think I can get it working. And then my reaction was basically, oh my god, yes, we're gonna get to pilot Rex. Seriously, if you haven't played this game, you get to play as Rex. Arguably the definitive Metal Gear and most people's favorite Metal Gear in the Metal Gear series. And it's awesome! And you get to play as Rex fighting Ray, the other definitive Metal Gear, and most people's other, everyone else's favorite Metal Gear of the various Metal Gears. Holy crap! That is so awesome. And I'm sorry, I just have to enthuse about it. I mean, I could talk about the thematic significance of the old versus the new. I could talk about how amazing it is to have the differences in style between what is effectively the tank versus the agility kind of thing. I could talk about how Ocelot uses Ray because that's when he was introduced and helped its production. I could talk about how Solid was using Rex and how he helped in its production thanks to the destruction of the TX-44, etc., etc. Or was it the 48? Whatever, the TX, the one in the original one. But it was just so awesome. Here's a question. As much as I talk about how Jack should have gotten his happy ending and deserved it, what the hell was up with his death scene against Outer Haven, excuse me? It really did feel very solidly like a death scene. He goes down, crying out Referosa's name, and then we don't see him again, and then just kind of in an offhand comment, oh, by the way, we managed to get him and repair him. There's a few scenes in this game that really feel kind of cheap in the drama they create. And that's one of them. And I have to admit, I have heard some people point to that scene as one of the reasons they don't like Raiden, because he goes through this whole death scene, and they might have been okay with it, except then he lived. One thing that has been debated a lot, and I have no answers either, is how much of Ocelot was in Ocelot during the course of this plan. Because they mentioned he used hypnotherapy and nanomachines to force himself to act like Liquid, right? And we all know definitively that his right at the end, his last few lines are, no question, Ocelot, aware of the fact that he is Ocelot, right? But whether or not he was aware he was Ocelot or whether or not he actually thought he was Liquid, debatable up until that point, we don't know. But I mention this because it is worth noting that one of the big points in favor of the fact that he might have actually thought he was Liquid was if he thought he was Ocelot, he was taking a lot of chances with how many times Solid almost died. Because it happens a lot. And there's a few times I was like, if this happened, this whole plan would just go to hell. I also want to mention one thing. As usual, this is a wonderful analogy of digital versus analog, natural versus artificial, etc. The Missouri, or that is to say the Missouri, which is what it should actually be called, versus Outer Haven. Awesome battle. For those of you who don't know what point defense means, it's basically the ability to shoot down projectile munitions before they hit you, right? Very important thing in warfare and has been for a long time, especially in fiction and in science fiction for that matter. The reason I mention this is most people in World War II era did that kind of thing manually calculating the trajectories, manually setting up the aiming based on degrees, etc. And that's a hard, difficult task to do. In the more modern age, that kind of stuff is done automatically, and in the more fictional scientific age of Metal Gear Solid 4, that is definitely done automatically. I mention that because the fact that the Missouri does as well as it does against the Outer Haven is amazing and just applaud-worthy. And I mention it because so few people I know actually caught onto that. Now, one person I know who was actually in the Navy did catch onto that, and his response was, holy crap, and just genuine pride at the sheer skill and effort and that is required for a analog World War II era battleship to be able to match up against a modern technological feat like Outer Haven and actually hold their own for some time. So that was an awesome scene and definitely done on purpose. I think we're almost to our end here, which is good because I'm running out of time. The final battle, the real final battle, the one between Ocelot and Solid is, it has so many layers of meaning. I could talk about it for a while, but again, I'm kind of on a thing, so let's just kind of hit a few of these here. It's intended to be, it's deliberately intended, we know this, to be an analog for the weariness of the series, the fact that the series is winding down, that whole theories of decay, and this is the end of the Metal Gear Solid franchise. Haha. The song and style changing within each game to signify the steps that have happened in order to bring us to this point, to literally hammer into the player the full implication of the fact that this is the end of this story arc. Again, as I mentioned, 1, 2, 3, 4 solve one very distinct, strong story arc, and this scene is a huge example of why. The fact that the new era that is consistent of neither of these people cannot go forward without their removal. Big Boss himself also mentions this, the fact that the old remnants have to go away, etc. The fact that it is literally the legacy of the boss in Ocelot, her son, and Big Boss in Solid, his son, clone, whatever you want to call it, their legacy being, the conflict between those two started everything way back in Metal Gear Solid 3, and the entire Metal Gear Solid series basically started when Big Boss killed the boss, and then it ends when Big Boss kills the boss, or rather, Solid kills Ocelot. I could also mention the fact that it is significant of the futility of this kind of war. The fact that the two of them literally have no reason to fight each other anymore. The war is over. The battles are over. There is nothing to be gained for either of them to fight each other, and yet they still do. Because that's the kind of thing that this series has been showing ever since Metal Gear Solid 1. The futility of that kind of conflict that exists for its own sake. Self-perpetual fighting, self-perpetual warfare. And again, forgive me for mentioning Revengeance yet again, but as we see, several of the individuals in Revengeance felt like that kind of fighting was the only thing they were ever good for, and therefore sought to perpetuate it even still. But finally, and most importantly of all, I feel like the last boss fight really, really emphasizes how terrible war is, better than anything else does in the whole series. It starts off awesome. They're fighting each other. There's cool action music. Tons of awesome CQC moves. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then as it winds down, they get more and more weary until we get to the Metal Gear Solid 4 portion. No more awesome music. Just a lone guitar or sitar, whatever it is, playing in the background, mournfully, as two old men who have nothing left to do with each other, who have nothing left to fight for, are very slowly, very wearily, very tiredly beating each other to death. We go from the severe romanticization of violence and warfare to the ugly truth of what that kind of thing is and can lead to. And that, I feel, is probably why that's basically the strongest scene, aka fight, in the entire game, and my favorite boss fight in this entire game, because it is so significant of the overall theme of the entire series. And it emphasizes in such a personal way how war can be such a terrible thing. Interesting concept here. Two more things, like I said, my last 2 points here. Big Boss did not stop David from taking his life, did he? David had the chance to, couldn't bring himself to, and Big Boss let him have that chance, didn't try to stop him. For the longest time I wondered why. Why just stand there? Because he was obviously right there, with Zero no less. Why just let him? The answer really occurred to me as I was rewatching it. John wanted to see if David wanted a chance to live, had that will, that desire to live. And once he saw that, he was more than grateful to give it to him. I am also going to admit that, yes, I cried at that last scene, especially the CQC hug. Big Boss is the final message of the entire series. The sad truth that has been present the entire game and has been manifested throughout the entire series so far. That experience and time teach wisdom that goes past knowledge, truth that goes past facts, essence, flavor, soul, these intangible things that we use to describe what we cannot understand, that goes past the mundane, the digital, the virtual, the artificial, the idea of how much a human being, an individual human being, really matters. And the boss's final message to him about leaving the world the way it is, by respecting the will of others, by understanding other people, and growing to work with each other instead of against, or trying to change the way the world works, implementing a system, etc. Big Boss himself is the ultimate allegory for that message of the artificial versus the natural that I've mentioned several times before. Because it took him all these long, long years, and all the experience and knowledge he gained over those years, to truly become a veteran, to truly be knowledgeable, wise, etc., to be able to capable of making his own decisions regardless of the facts that were staring him in the face, if you understand what I mean. I'm not sure what else I have to add to that. Last point, I swear. There's a theory, but that's been circling around for a while, and I've been aware of it, that, well, at the end, Otacon, Otacon mentions that he will be David's living witness, journeying with him so that, someone will know that he walked this earth, right? The thing that's interesting is the idea that maybe All of the series so far has just been Otacon's retelling of that. That's the theory. And while I don't really buy that, it would explain a lot of the discrepancies and, shall we say, romanticizations or meta essences of the previous games that have existed, including this one. And it would also explain why some things are thrown into more contrast and relief than others. And given how Otacon has been present for, at the very least, pretty much all of 1, 2, and 4, it would explain a lot of how the story has unfolded the way it has. Got nothing else to say. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I will see you in the next one.